Hello, my name is Helga Edwards, and the topic for today's message is dealing with our inner critic. If as children we were controlled and experienced boundary violations, we often then feel powerless and have difficulty saying no to others. And there are many types of boundary violations. It's good for us to be able to recognize them. There are physical boundary violations, and that's when someone touches us, tickles us, hits us, goes into our room, uses our things, etc. when we don't want them to. There are also intellectual boundary violations. That's when someone discounts what we think. When someone says, "How could you think that?" And it's not like where each can have their own opinion and you can agree to disagree, but it's where you're not allowed to have your own thoughts. Then there's emotional boundary violations. It's when our feelings are invalidated or criticized. You have no right to feel angry. You shouldn't feel sad or upset. Those are examples of emotional boundary violations. Again, it's not where everyone's entitled to feel the way they feel about things, but people insist that you feel the way they do. There are also social boundary violations, time, money, and spiritual boundary violations. Now, when we experience control and boundary violations, we often then develop an inner critic inside. This part of us can never be satisfied, always tells us we should be doing more, and tells us that our feelings and needs don't matter. This inner critic can also be an outer critic. This part of us either criticizes ourselves or others, or switches back and forth. Now, a person with a louder inner critic will often be attracted to someone with a louder outer critic because it fits. See, the person with the louder outer critic believes everyone else is responsible for his pain. A person with a louder inner critic believes he is responsible for his own and others' pain. Now, this teaching is based on transactional analysis and cognitive behavioral theory. So here's the inner critic. Okay, so again, this part is really, it's loud. It's not like an audible voice, but it's thoughts that are very loud and persistent. And this part of us can never be satisfied. There's a lot of should statements. I should do this. Oh, I should have done that. And it's thoughts like, I need to do more. It's not good enough. I'm not good enough. My feelings and needs don't matter. So when we have an inner critic, we then develop rules to survive this inner pressure. Okay, over here, rules to survive. Now, we really only have three options when we have an inner critic. And one option is to comply, to perform, to try to please this inner critic. And often then we're staying very, very busy because there's so many things we should be doing. So number one, we perform and we try to please. The second option we have is to rebel and do the opposite of this inner pressure. Rebel. And the third option is to avoid, try to ignore it, to give up, to run away, to hide, or try to escape this inner pressure. So we try to ignore it, and we try to run away from it. Okay. Now often we burn out when we try number one, which is to please and comply. And then we avoid and rebel. And sometimes we find ourselves struggling with all three responses. Very often in childhood, people will do number one. Okay, so if I try to do really good at school, and if I really try to do, please everybody at home, and try to please my friends so that they'll like me, and I'll always put everybody else first because my feelings and needs don't matter, and there's this pressure. Sometimes people will do that in childhood, but then often by their teen years, they're feeling pretty burned out, and then they rebel. So that's very common, but it can happen later in life as well. Now there's another part of ourselves called the emotional self. Okay? But the emotional self gets buried. So here's our emotional self. And that's the part of us that has feelings and needs and longings. This is our heart and soul. But this part gets shut down, gets ignored and buried because of the inner critic, which is saying you just need to perform and you need to please other people and you need to do all this, and your feelings, they need to be pushed away. Now, this part needs to be listened to and nurtured, and it's a real part of us. And when our emotional self, when our heart and soul is neglected, this part often takes on a life of its own, trying to get its emotional needs met in unhealthy ways, such as addictions and obsessions around substances, food, sex, shopping, etc., etc. Now, we need to understand that our inner critic is actually a good part of ourselves. This is very important to understand. This is a part of us that's there, it's put there to protect us. But this part believes that the way to move forward in life is to perform and to avoid our pain. This part of us has learned this growing up. But we can teach this part of us the truth. We can teach this part of us things that will help instead of make life difficult. And then we can be less divided inside of ourselves. This part can then do its job properly and be a nurturer, a protector, a cheerleader, and a motivator instead of a self-critic. If we grow up and we're in a lot of emotional pain as children and there's no one there to help us or guide us or listen to our pain, we can very easily develop an inner critic which says, you know, we just have to bury this pain and stay busy doing all of these things. So it's developed very quickly and easily in children. So we need to look at what's going on inside of us, and with God's help we can develop healthy internal boundaries. Often people cannot put in place healthy outer boundaries until they put in place internal boundaries. So the lies that the inner critic believes that we have internalized growing up, this is the main issue. Because of those lies, we have developed these rules to survive, and because of those lies, we have buried our emotional self. So we can replace these lies with God's truth and create healthy inner boundaries. So I want to talk about some of the common lies of the inner critic. One lie is, it was my fault that others mistreated me as a child. The truth is, it was not your fault that as a child others mistreated you, had problems, or left you. When others mistreated you, it was because they had problems inside of themselves, likely problems from their own childhood that they had never dealt with. Now, if you have spiritual questions about suffering and pain, I encourage you to view the message entitled God and Suffering. So another lie is, I have to perform in order to be valued or loved. The truth is, God says you are important and always loved, valuable, precious, and priceless to Him. It's okay to make mistakes. As humans, we make mistakes. You don't have to be perfect or perform in order to be loved. And even when we make wrong choices and mistakes, God says He always loves us. Romans 5:8 says God demonstrates His own love towards us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Verse 6 says, when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. And verse 10 says, while we were yet His enemies, God sent His Son. Think about the story of the prodigal son in Luke 15. Did his value ever change in his father's eyes while he was living in rebellion? Never. It never changed. Our value stays constant in God's eyes despite our behavior. Our behavior is important and it has consequences. But God does not equate our behavior with our value or worth as people. In Psalm 139 and 149, it says that God created our inmost being, our heart and soul. He created all of us. And it says that we are wonderfully made. It says that God rejoices over His children as well. Jesus chose to die a horrible death for us just so that He could be with us forever in heaven. What does that say about our value in God's eyes? If Ephesians 3, verse 16 to 19 says, "May you be strengthened with might through God's Spirit in the inner person, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend what is the width and length and depth and height, to know the love of Christ, which passes all knowledge." Another lie is, my feelings and needs don't matter, and I must avoid my pain. Now the truth is, your feelings and needs matter very much to God and are equally important to others. Matthew 22, when someone asked Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus said, it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus said, on these commandments hang all the laws and the prophets. So let's look at the first commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Many people, they love God with their mind and their strength. They learn about God. They try to think about things that are pleasing to God. They do things. They love God with their strength by helping others, but they avoid their heart and soul. And God said, no, love me with your heart and soul. These are the parts of us, our feelings, our needs, our longings. David in the Psalms poured out his feelings and his needs and longings to God beautifully in the Psalms. And Jesus in the garden poured out his feelings to God as well, to God his Father. In 1 Peter 5, verse 5 to 7, it says, cast all your cares on God, for he cares for you. He wants to hear about our cares in our heart. Psalm 62:8 says, pour out your heart before God. Your feelings matter to God. He wants to hear all about them. He wants to have emotional intimacy with you like he had with David. Now God has feelings too, and we're made in God's image. Jesus was sad. In John 11, verse 35, it says, Jesus wept when his friend Lazarus died. Jesus felt angry at times. In Mark 3, verse 1 to 5, Jesus was angry at the Pharisees, the religious leaders of the day, for oppressing the people. Jesus also felt pain, temptation, stress, and anguish. And again, in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus didn't hide his pain. He didn't bury his pain. He told God his Father all about it, and angels came to minister to him. Now, some people are afraid that they'll get stuck in their anger if they get in touch with their feelings. But we can make a conscious choice to give our anger over to God. Also, it is easier to let go of anger once we learn to have healthy boundaries. So the steps to deal with our feelings is to acknowledge our pain and anger, and also express our pain and anger in a healthy way. It could be talking to someone, venting to someone. It could be writing out your feelings. It can be praying and telling God about our feelings, and then to give it over to God. So to acknowledge our pain and anger, to express our pain and anger in a healthy way, and then to make a conscious choice to give our pain and anger over to God. This is healthy emotional processing, and it is a process. It does take time. Now let's look at the second commandment that Jesus said. He said, love your neighbor as yourself. And the word here, as, means equally. This is the overall commandment regarding our relationships with other people. Your feelings and needs are equally important to others. Their feelings and needs should not always come first, and your feelings and needs should not always come first. It's about health and balance. There are times when you will put others first, and there are times when you will need to say no to others in order to take care of yourself. Which leads to the next lie, which is, I should never say no to others. The truth is, you can say no to others at times in order to take care of yourself. In Luke 5:16, it says Jesus often withdrew into the wilderness to pray. He often would leave and take time to restore his strength and have time alone. In Mark 6:31, after the disciples spent a lot of time helping others with their needs, Jesus said to them, come aside by yourselves to a deserted place and rest a while. It is important to God that we take time to rest. You can give yourself permission to get away at times from all the pressures and needs around you. The Bible talks about the importance of giving to others and helping others, and it also talks a lot about the importance of rest. It's about balance. It's about loving ourselves equally to others. We can talk to our inner critic, and this is, I find, a very effective way of creating inner boundaries. We can talk to this part of ourselves, and we can say, thank you for trying to protect me, but the way you're doing it has actually hurt me. And I want to teach you how you can protect me. The truth is, it's not my fault that others mistreated me as a child. The truth is, my feelings and needs matter as much as other people's feelings and needs. The truth is, I can say no to others, and I am always loved, valuable, precious, and priceless to God. Now, if we change these internal beliefs, okay, how will our rules to survive change? Well, there's not going to be all this guilt and pressure and stress inside anymore, so we won't feel all crushed inside and pushed to either perform, rebel, or escape. We can have more peace inside and learn healthy ways to cope and survive, such as sharing and journaling our feelings, instead of avoiding them and then having emotional outbursts or trying to meet our emotional needs in physical ways, which doesn't work. So we can process our feelings. We can learn to clearly communicate our needs to others. And it's hard to know what we need if we're not in touch with our feelings, if they're buried away. We can learn to say no. We can learn to respect our own and other people's boundaries. We can be honest. We can use humor. We can be creative. We can practice healthy self-care and healthy distractions. We can have fun. Wouldn't it be amazing if the inner critic would function as the protector, which is its role? And wouldn't it be amazing if our rules to survive became, hey, I'm going to process my feelings, I'm going to learn to say no and have boundaries, I'm going to communicate my needs clearly to others, and I'm going to practice healthy self-care and have fun, as well as serving others. And then those rules to survive become healthy and healthy self-care, and then we can be in touch with our emotional self instead of having this part buried away. And then all of these three parts can actually be in agreement, and we can have healthy inner boundaries and inner peace. So instead of staying busy or high to avoid your pain, you can learn to actually embrace your pain and learn from it. You can allow your emotional self, your heart and soul, to exist and to have a voice. A house divided against itself will fall. We need to learn to love ourselves, or our emotional self will cling to an imperfect person or thing to feel loved and supported. And then we give our power away, and it leaves us feeling very vulnerable. We can allow Jesus to love and reparent our emotional self. He is the only perfect parent who will always love us perfectly and who will never leave us nor forsake us. And we can learn to love ourselves too, instead of criticizing ourselves. Our inner critic can learn to become a protector and a nurturer of our emotional self. We become all split inside when we have an inner critic. The part of us that tries to be perfect and please, the number one here, can sometimes get frustrated with and even hate the parts of us that rebel or avoids. Does that sound familiar? You want to do something and a part of you seems to not let you, and then you think, what is wrong with me? And you hate this part of yourself. And then we get all split inside. But we can learn to have compassion on these parts of us and see what's behind the unwanted behavior or rebellion. What's often behind rebellion is fear, shame, and not wanting to be controlled. These parts of us need help, not hatred. So what can we do with all this information? And also to summarize, if you're asked or told to do something, be aware of your automatic response. It will often be like the response you had as a child or a teen. Do you comply right away? Oh, I have to do this, and then later feel resentful? Or do you rebel by doing the opposite? They're not going to control me, I'll do the opposite. Or do you ignore and avoid inner pressure? And then what happens, usually things pile up, things get worse, and then you feel paralyzed. Know that you are being controlled by the inner critic when you react in any of these ways. So it can be helpful to catch these reactions, be familiar with what your reactions usually are, and then to step back and ask yourself, if I didn't feel this pressure inside, what would I choose to do? Or what would I want to do in this situation? How do I feel about this? And what are the feelings and needs of others in this situation? When I pray about it, what do I feel God would want me to do? And it's important to understand that the inner critic is never the voice of God, never. God is not pushy, manipulative, or controlling. And even when God would like us to do something, he leaves the choice with us. So instead of saying to yourself, I need to do this, I should do this, I have to do this, it can be very helpful to say, I choose to do this, or I choose not to do this. Pay attention to your feelings. Are you feeling afraid and guilty and exhausted? Are you feeling angry and controlled? Are you feeling tired and like you just want to give up? Listen to these feelings. What's behind them? What needs to change? One thing that we can change is how we speak to ourselves and what we believe. It's good to remind ourselves daily until we get a hold of these truths that it's not my fault that others mistreated me as a child. My feelings and needs matter equally to others. I can say no to others at times to take care of myself. And I am always loved, valuable, precious, and priceless to God. We can learn to love ourselves, speak truth to ourselves, and bring our pain to God.